there and ask.
I can see with the background, it has your name and it says management consultancy. But just briefly to the audience that will be looking at this, introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background, your work, and
Right. Yeah, so like most, I'm an accidental fundraiser when I started off my career. It so happened I was a trailing spouse. Soon after marriage, moved to Indonesia and then India. Sorry, from India to Indonesia and to Singapore. And since I could not have got a job on a dependent visa, I decided I'm just going to volunteer, instead of just doing coffee mornings and bridge evenings and stuff like that, that usually the trailing spouses seem to have done at that time. And I just kind of liked what I was doing. And one assignment I was given was, it was the beginnings of the community chest in Singapore. And I was asked whether I would volunteer to be a fundraiser for the community chest. And I didn't know what I was getting into. I said, sure, just tell me what I need to do. So they told me that I should go to the different manufacturing units across then in Singapore and speak to the employees and make a presentation and get them to sign up to the very inaugural campaign that we had through payroll giving. I had no clue what I was signing up for. I said, sure, I'll do that. So I would go and make my presentation and was getting like 90%
oh my,
sign up rates. And that's when the chairman of the organization said, Usha, you want to join? Like, we'll pay you for doing this. And I kind of felt like, yeah, I would do this for free, but if you're going to pay me for it, I'll get on the team. And that's how the journey began. And I realized I quite liked the idea of fundraising, of being able to outreach and convince people of the needs, which very often they don't know of, and especially in a place like Singapore. In the 80s, it was one, it still is one of the four Asian tigers, as they call it, along with Korea, Hong Kong, and China. So it's so a lot of people don't know. So it just felt like I was given this opportunity to help people understand a piece of life that they may not be aware of. And then for some reason, they do say yes.
yeah, fantastic. And volunteering seems to have been a big part of your early career and I guess that's something that we both have to explain to the younger generation joining the sector. Is I started as a volunteer, you volunteered afterwards at Habitat for Humanity, and people often say, what's the route to entry? And I say, well, first of all, you need to be passionate, you need to be engaged, you need to like it, but also volunteering is a way of finding out more. What's your view of volunteering as a point of entry?
Oh, so true. So taking on from my community chest journey, while I was with the community chest, I knew I was doing well. I was, rising up the corporate ladder, so to say, all of that. But I also knew if I could raise $1 in Singapore, that's only so much. But if I could raise $1 for Sri Lanka or for India or one of the other developing countries, that $1 could do so much more locally. And hence, I decided I would just volunteer with charities that are in the region. And those were the days way before internet and easy communication. So I literally used to get online in the middle of the night because it was cheaper. Midnight calls were cheaper, and I would call them and I would tell them how to edit, or I would ask them to fax, good old fax, their grant proposal, and I would edit it so that their storytelling. I didn't know there was a word called storytelling then, but I would rewrite it for them, and those proposals started to get funded. And in the 80s, aid was a big area of work in Asia, where much of the funding was not so much fundraising, but really grant, in the form of aid. And that was something I really didn't like, but I knew that that step had to be taken before we get anywhere else. And then I came across an organization called the International Fundraising Group, where Daryl, you and I met back in the early 90s. And I started volunteering, and that goes back to the volunteering. because I had the opportunity to meet folks from the international fundraising group at that point in time. And I was like, where is Asia? You guys call it the international. And where is the international other than, with all due respect, a lot of middle-aged white men? So I guess the squeaky wheel that I was told, okay, set up the Asia committee. And then so we started the Asia Pacific committee of the resource. Well, it was International Fundraising Group. And over time, I went on to join the board and to chair it. And it was during my watch that we rebranded uh, the organization to the Resource Alliance, the name that it
Yeah.
is now known to be.
Yeah,
So
we
that's
met back at
volunteer
that time,
journey.
and I've got to admit,
Sorry.
I saw you as a very much a transformational leader on the board. I mean,
Oh, thank
I really do recall it being. I mean, I was a young man, but there
you.
were
Yes.
men who were much older, very fantastic fundraisers, Guy Stringer and the like.
Yes.
But I think you transitioned the organization under your watch into being the really international and more representative, and now I would say diverse organization if you look at it.
Yeah, I'm quite proud of the team that worked at that, the pivot at that point in time. And we had Ezra Maguire, we had Nilda Belaine, so we had people from different parts of the world, Hungary,
Yeah,
South Africa, it's not even South Africa, Namibia, and so on. So it was great. And that pivoting work that we did was all voluntary.
yeah,
So a lot of times people mistook me to be working because I had spent so much of time on my volunteer stuff. But it just was something that I felt excited about doing
yeah.
for the community, so to say, the fundraising community. And it also resulted in me getting my next job because it was at such a conference, a International Fundraising Congress, which is always held in October in Holland, in the Netherlands, that the international director of Habitat for Humanity happened to be in the audience. And then I was the first Asian staff to take on a regional role for Habitat for Humanity Asia Pacific. So I would say, just like the chairman of the community chest saw me volunteering and working in the trenches, so to say, Habitat for Humanity found me on stage at the International Fundraising Congress. So, yes, volunteering, going back to our point about volunteering, it's always been a huge builder of my own career, but also my own skills, competencies, vision, all of that. Yes, because you have a clean slate when you volunteer. There are no
Absolutely.
KPIs and all of that. Yeah.
Actually, it's a good point you make because most people assume volunteering would mean volunteering at a typical non-profit, but actually volunteering on association boards, working groups. I've spent
Yes.
many years volunteering for the Association of Fundraising Professionals out of Washington, and it broadens your horizon, I find, because you meet people from very different backgrounds.
And now there is a lot of focus on social networks and social capital. But even in the 80s and 90s, although the words may not have been much of a buzz of social capital, it's your volunteering networks is where your social capital is. And you and I talking today, 30 years after we first met,
Exactly.
shows the strength of that social capital. You in Madrid, me in Singapore, but we still it's like just yesterday that we've
It
been
feels like it.
friends.
It feels
Yeah.
like it. It's
So that's
interesting,
social
and
capital. Yeah.
when we started, I guess even the name of a fundraiser, probably your family, certainly my family, said, "Well, that's very nice, but how do you earn any money? Do you get paid?" There was no concept, at least in the early 80s, mid 80s, early 90s, even, that this was a profession.
Yes.
How have you seen that changed in your career, both in Singapore and especially in Asia, where we've seen enormous growth in recent years?
Yes. Well, I must say that question hasn't changed, but it's not so much how will you get paid. It's more about, you are getting paid for doing this? That's like even worse because now you kind of feel like apologizing to them that for being paid for doing a good job or, for just doing a job. So that hasn't changed much. Although many of the funders now recognize that the whole systematic fundraising, strategic way of, resourcing a vision is important. I must say that the general mindset still is
Yeah.
like, charities, they're doing good, but they should just do good on love and fresh air. Fortunately in Singapore there is a lot more professionalizing of it, because the Ministry of Community Services kind of have put structures in place. There are salary scales, or at least guidance on
Oh,
salary scales, so that kind of helps, because when the policy is supportive of that environment, it becomes easier also for
true.
example, in Singapore, the fundraising efficiency ratio, as we call it, i.e., how much can you spend to raise a dollar, is 30%, which is very generous
Yeah.
by many standards. Where they're not saying, oh, you keep it at 5 or you keep it at 10. Like at the time when we were talking China, with the China Charity Act, when they kept it at 10. And it was really suffocating the charities, because there's really not much they could do with and for mass marketing, especially if you're doing major gifts, maybe, but
Mm.
so at 30%, I think the fundraising environment is a lot more supportive, and because the donors know that you can spend that much, you're allowed even to spend that much, they know that it will go into investments. Unfortunately, do the charities actually, despite being given that approval, they're just spending 5 and
Yeah, yeah.
10%. So now that's a whole different story. But in terms of creating an environment where fundraising could thrive, Singapore does have a pretty good edge on that.
That's true. And certainly my team, when we've done studies of the Singapore market, we found a very enabling environment and very open conversations you can have with officials, where even in a country like Spain, you wouldn't even know which ministry to speak to, let alone, actually dedicated people who can advise you on that within the government, structures and so forth.
So
You've
one of the other organizations I am on the advisory of, and again I volunteer, is the International Council for Nonprofit Law.
Yeah,
So we do really look at the enabling or hindering environments towards fundraising, and as part of the team that did some of that research, and yeah, so we had that comparative study, and many Asian countries still have a lot of catching up to do, and some are doing well.
that's a very good resource. Actually, I think in the article that we're going to do, I think I'll reference that, because certainly it's a resource that my team refer back to constantly, and it's kind of one of those organizations that keeps below the radar but does such value work for the sector. Interestingly, about enabling environments, obviously India, where you originate from, or you came from, Bombay, Mumbai, many years ago,
Yes,
87, I think it was, to
correct.
Singapore. They're massive non-profit sector, but funny enough, for international organizations, becoming more challenging to invest in fundraising or growth in any sense. Have you seen any other developments similar to that, where we're actually, as well as creating an enabling environments now, there's a little bit of a kickback on civil society?
Well, the civil society part, I am not going to touch on yet, but the enabling environment, frankly, I am for the restrictions.
Oh, really?
In the sense that when you are conditioned, and as I mentioned, from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, charities in many of the developing countries have been conditioned that you have to be a aid recipient or a grantor or grantee, as opposed to a grantor. And that conditioning is something that always irked me, even when I did help them with their grant proposal.
Yeah.
It always irked me that why are we doing this? But I knew they had to get the money, so I would do it. And then when I had the opportunity with Habitat for Humanity to take on the Asia Pacific role, I decided that we're going to make sure Asia gets to be self-sufficient. And that was my test of the pudding, so to say, because when I did it, we were actually able to turn Asia into a donor region than
Absolutely.
a recipient region. So when Katrina happened in the United States, one of the first checks that went from across the border was from Asia to United States to support
Yeah.
the victims of Katrina and to rebuild
New
the
Orleans. Yeah.
homes there under Habitat for Humanity. So in that sense, I am happy to say that that restriction actually now makes the Asian philanthropists, Asian charity staff, Asian board members, Asian public to say, well, if money is not going to come, but this is an important need, then I'm going to step up and do something about it. And despite that hindrance to foreign, transfers, like in India, FCRA, the Foreign Currency
Contribution
Act,
matters. Yeah.
yeah, so that's still there, and you can still. It's not like you totally can't, but that limitation has made them want figure out, and even the big ones, right? uh, the UNHCRs of the world, the Greenpeaces of the world, although there are other elements that may hinder, but when it comes to fundraising, they've proven that they can
Oh,
raise money.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So that kind of gives me I'm kind of happy
Good.
that in a sort of this point doesn't get much currency. It's always about how restrictive it has become. But through this interview, I want to show the other side,
Yeah.
that because of that hindrance, like in the case of COVID, right, we have figured out, we have reset. Similarly, because of the restrictions, the Asian NGOs now are standing on their own feet rather than figuring out, will somebody give us a grant?
That's true. That's a big,
So
big
I
cultural change.
Yes. So I think for local fundraising, indigenous fundraising, it's a good thing. And with India being what it is, and many of the Asian countries, in terms of the GDP and the overall population, while there is a huge community of need, there is also a huge community that should step up and take responsibility. And I think that restriction has helped that component of the community to step up and say, all right, if this is important, I'm going to step up.
Okay.
So for
So,
me,
certainly, we've seen South Korea grow enormously during this time. I mean, one of the
yeah.
biggest single fundraising power hubs in the world. And I was honored actually a few years ago to be invited by the government to speak at a conference where they were actually celebrating the impact of non-profits on changing civil society and even the national wealth of the country, and how to create a better enabling environment for more of that, which is quite an achievement.
Yeah, so I'm fine with not being an aid recipient.
Yeah, yeah.
It's about time we got off the shackles.
Now, you and me met in Shenzhen as well a few years ago, and that definitely provoked my big interest I have in Chinese fundraising, or fundraising in China these days, and was speaking to a colleague, Tony Lowe of the One Foundation
Mhm.
there only
Yeah.
last week. Um, Interestingly for China, the biggest challenge my colleagues there tell me, including the Fundraising Association, is moving from a digital world of fundraising to a non-digital world. And I'm sure you've probably been asked to address that in various ways.
Yeah,
What's your thoughts about that dilemma in China?
which is so true. Because it is, with the Sichuan earthquake, is when the Chinese
Yeah,
actually caught on to the idea of private philanthropy in 2008. While others, in the past, it was always at best the big foundations or the big families that were doing it, and of course the government. But just the man on the street or the woman on the street never thought of himself or herself as a philanthropist. But with the earthquake, that kind of opened, and the fact that around that time is when digital was picking up. So it just became a natural, segue that digital became the first port of call
yeah,
when it comes to mass marketing, mass fundraising, public fundraising. And that's brilliant. And it continues, it totally continues with COVID and all of that.
yeah.
Now, how do you? So I work in China too. So one of the things that happens is the platforms are not the kind of platforms that we think of when we're thinking of digital fundraising in other parts of the world. Policy questions like who owns the database? Do you
Yes.
even know who your donor is? Now, that's where that real challenge comes in as to why they're not able to transition from digital to offline, if you were to call it. Because if I knew on my list is Daryl Upsall, and I knew where I could contact him, maybe I would have had a conversation with him to say, hey, let's catch up for tea. Or we have this event, open house. Will you come visit our home? Something along those lines. Because that data is not available, that's the
Yeah.
catch 22 to me. And there are ways in which you can capture but then it's 2 3 steps more than,
Yeah.
and when the need is so immense and it's working the way it is, um, charity leaders are not stepping up and
No.
saying, okay, no, we need to figure a way to transition from just that online transactional giving to a more relational
Indeed.
relationship.
And I guess it's because they're so micro donations in their hundreds of millions that the cost would even be more than 30% to even make a
Totally.
return call or anything like that. And the
Yes,
other
yes.
trend in China, and I know this is really a big part of your work, is in the leadership giving area. So donor advised funds. When I was in Shanghai, I was asked to advise even the University Center on Philanthropy there on donor advised funds. It's interesting how the younger entrepreneurs are actually turning to things like donor advised funds in a collaborative way rather than my name at the top of a big foundation. So
Yeah.
have you come across any of that in your work?
Yeah, yeah. So that whole collaboration idea, and to some extent, also seeing charities as a middleman, and that's frightening. Both ways.
Yeah.
One, because they are giving to learn how it's done, and then they're collaboratively going and figuring out how they can do it themselves.
Yeah.
So, and again, just like in the Indian case, I would say if you're seen just as a middleman, then maybe you deserve to be cut out.
Yeah.
So if you, as a charity member, an entity leader of a charity organization board, step up and add value and show them why, or even the whole social enterprise idea, where you have knowledge that you can share. So it
Yeah.
could be fee for service, it could be, not necessarily a charity model. So I've always looked at the silver lining every time I look at a dark cloud. For some reason, I tend to want to play on the silver lining rather than in the dark cloud. So,
That's true.
and for me, that's my advice. And when I'm working with them, is okay, if they're going to cut you out, what is that one thing that you have that they'll never have? And it's usually the ground knowledge, they
Yeah.
understand it, what, think, okay, then let's repackage that as an offering to them, and that they are very happy to buy
Yeah. Yeah.
because they
Interesting.
can't get that. So rather than look at it from a donation point of view, you may want to look at it as a co-created product point of view. So again, while there will be hindrances because of that mindset of the young entrepreneurs, there could be also possible collaborations if the charity person is also as entrepreneurial. And that's where the entrepreneurialness of a charity leader becomes important.
And that leads to my penultimate question, because very much I've seen you and your career transition from, like most of us started in fundraising, but you've moved very much into the organizational change, social change. Describe that a little bit to us, because it's kind of entrepreneurial and slightly different to the way many organizations and people have gone. And I find it fascinating, that transition.
Yeah. So while I started with fundraising and I was very excited and and still is passionate about it, I realized as a consultant when I'm working on, and my initial consultancy work was also in fundraising, I realized that it is when I tell them, for as example, okay, how much do you need to raise? Let's set the target for the next 3 years. How much do you need to raise? And they start giving me a number, and I say, okay, now break this down for me year on year. Where does the money go? And they start breaking it down. And I realize they only figured 60% of the numbers. They haven't put in the indirect cost of fundraising. They haven't put in the cost of piloting some programmatic interventions. They haven't put it, and then they haven't. And when you put all that, they realize, oh, we've only been asking for 60% of what we need. No wonder. And there has been aha moments where boards and ED executive directors of charities have said, no wonder we don't have money at the end of the year, because they're just brilliant people with brilliant hearts and great social work, ethics and ethos, but not necessarily maybe the business sense of it. So that's where I found that. So, and hence financial literacy for nonprofits became a key area, helping them understand cash flow, helping them understand how not to take unrestricted money and for some reason restrict it and get stuck in that ring fence, because your auditors are going to say, oh, this is restricted. And they're like, oh no, but that's okay, because, and the auditor said, no, this is ring fenced, you cannot spend it anywhere else. And then they don't know what hit them, simply because they don't know the difference between designated gift, undesignated gift, restricted gift, unrestricted gift. And that's when no business school teaches that, other than if you're in a charity
Yeah.
environment, and the policies that go with it, the charity policies that go with charity accounting. So hence the finance track came into being. And then so you had now the spectrum of finding out how much is needed and an accurate one of that, and then finding how to get that funding. And then I realized, and in Asia and Chinese, they say the fish rots from the head.
Yeah.
That the board needs to be educated. They need to understand what their responsibility is as board members or trustees of a nonprofit. And hence that emerged into board evaluations and
Mm.
board retreats and those kind of to help the board members. And I'm really, really proud and most grateful. In fact, in Singapore, my company actually works with the ministry,
Oh,
and
well.
for such uh, projects, assignments, my charity clients only pay 20%. The government subsidizes
Wow.
80%, just to make sure the governance is in good shape and form. And as you would know, Singapore is known, no corruption. It's known for its gold standards when it comes to a clean chit in management, whether it's the country or the charity. So I've been most grateful for having, and of course that was possible because of my track record,
Yeah.
having worked in the sector for over 30 years. So board evaluations, board retreats, things like that are services my charity, my consultancy offers the
Yeah.
charities in Singapore that are also co-funded by the government.
That's
So that's
impressive. Yeah. That's.
yeah. So
I
that's
mean,
like the whole governance piece.
and it's often the case, even in fundraising consultancy, isn't it? People come to you with a problem saying we actually need money, and in fact, you go into the evaluation. You say actually the problem is not the money. The
Yes,
problem is the structure that enables or doesn't enable you to be
totally.
successful in those areas. So
Yeah.
it's great, and
And
it's
that has helped, like, it sort of cross sells everything.
you
From a
know
business point of view, it does, because now that the chairman of the board knows that you're good at certain things, and when they have a problem, they obviously, you become the port of call for solutions beyond board or beyond finance or beyond fundraising or beyond strategy.
fantastic. If only we had more enlightened governments in other parts of the world that would help us with that. Seriously.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
did promise that was the penultimate question. I know we've gone way longer because it's always interesting to talk with you. But my parting question really is, you're seen as a beacon, as an example. You are somebody that people admire from around the world in your work. And if you were to give one piece of advice to somebody new to the sector, looking at the beginning of their career, what would it be?
One piece. Okay. I would say start by understanding the ground. So if you decide to work in the nonprofit sector, start with volunteering,
Yeah.
because it's not just about sending your CV in and hoping you land a job. Uh, because I know when I'm recruiting, whether for my clients or for my own team, one of the first questions I will ask is, so which charity have you been
Yeah.
involved with? Doesn't matter the cause, what has been your involvement in the sector. And if somebody tells me that they've not had the time to get down to it, I
Yeah.
just know that I don't want. I mean, I may be being very judgmental here, but I just know that that person may not have what it takes, because they're just looking for a job, and they think they are going to be the savior of the sector rather than the other way around, where the sector is saving a lot of people, and
Yeah.
you're going to add value to ensuring you can save better, faster, longer. So for me, I would say anybody wanting to join the nonprofit sector should start with that mindset that you're not there to save anything. You're there to save your own soul in that sense of using your skill
Yeah.
for the betterment of the planet, the people, the policy, whatever the cause may be. But you really are there to add value, not to save anyone.
Sound advice, Usha, and wonderful. A pleasure to talk with you as always. I wish you every success. I hope the year of the ox
Yes.
is pulling hard for you, and the ox is working and ensuring you have a bullish year, so to speak. So,
Thank you.
thank you
And
very
the same
much.
to you, Daryl.
It's a
All the very
pleasure,
best.
and
Stay
I
safe.
will end the conversation now if that's okay with you.
Sure. Thank you.